you go, it's like, well, you could contain the topic a little better if you didn't have this many people, but the topic is so big.
Mhm. Well, here's one thing. Speaking of that, and this is interesting because and we're a lot of us are from different backgrounds, even just in our Asianness, and each I've found in every different person that I know that's like of different descent, Chinese, Japanese, Indian, West Indian, Korean, although we all also look at each other differently.
Mhm.
Like it's one of the weird, I don't know if it's weird, but it's like the way I see it, it's weird. But I think our parents and our older generations also came with their own prejudice against other Asian people, and sometimes that kind of bled into our interactions with other people of different cultures as well. And I've I always kind of feel like there's not enough people already talking like this, where it's like we're all kind of coming from different backgrounds, because it was never a thing.
There was a representative who
Mm-hmm.
recently came out, and for the whole Korean community, that because it's okay for her to say this because she's Korean, that she doesn't want Chinese immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so angering, but also there's like a deep sadness to know that she has internalized so much to align herself with the oppressors.
Mm-hmm.
This idea of the model minority myth and aligning yourself to erase almost your Asianness to be safer.
Well, I've always tried to say, like, the second you allow one person to slip into that category of like, we don't want them, no matter what you are, who you are, it just opens the door for another person, another minority, another person of a different orientation. One slip up and that's it.
And the thing is she positioned herself in such a way to be utilized as a tool so
Mm-hmm.
that other people can come out and say, well, this other Asian person said it, so I can say it.
There's a grid that they use for the level of acculturation. I can't remember it off the top of my head, so I just Googled it. And on the x-axis, it's the maintenance of your heritage culture. And on the y-axis, it is your level of cultural adaptation to the majority culture. Some of the psych people are nodding their heads. Um, if you have a strong connection with your heritage culture, but you don't have a strong connection with the majority culture, it's considered separation, and you feel isolated, you feel weak, helpless. If it's the opposite, where you almost over connect with the majority culture, but you lose a sense of your heritage culture, which it sounds like. I don't know where you are in relation to me, so I'm just gonna, what sounds like what Liz was saying happened with this politician. We call that assimilation. And from a socio-political standpoint, that can be so dangerous for the minority culture, because now they have a they have there's someone who is speaking radicalized extremist beliefs from the majority culture as a token mouthpiece.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That the media and pop culture is a representation of the social political atmosphere.
Yes.
And that when we talk about a variety of these things, erasure is a huge component, the gaslighting and the silence. And those are huge. It's not just like what representations are we seeing, but it's also what we are not seeing. When they do things like the Crazy Rich Asian show that they did on Netflix, but they're not showing how this, if you look at the demographics of Asian Americans, the wealth gap is the largest out of any demographic. When you look at the education, it's so varied. And when we look at some of the ways in which these token representations, these kinds of tropes that are introduced and encourage for people to believe, sometimes people actually end up saying, well, oh, you know what? I have to align in order for my own safety. And it's so hurtful to really think about how many people are in so much pain. And if there were spaces where people could have more conversations safely and to really unpack some of that, there might be a lot more growth.
And
One or two
healing.
weeks ago, Billy and I and Harpreet and a friend of ours, we were talking about these things. We got into it's like, well, what group do I belong to? So I was going through the fact that, okay, a whole lot of my heritage, there's some German, but a whole lot of Anglo, but there's 3/16 Native American. And he said, well, there you go. I was like, no, there's no cultural connection. It's been erased. And those individuals had safety reasons for why they were doing it back then. But there's Cherokee and Chickasaw, but absolutely no connection got passed down at all.
A lot of it is self-defense mechanisms, how I see it, like where you're like, I'm not one of them. I'm like everybody else. And that is part of the discussion as well. It's kind of like how we see our identity and our relationship with it, our culture, our background. And we're making our own new culture now because, we as North Americans are also, kind of, because I have problems whenever I go back to Asia. I know nothing. I don't feel like anything. And people look at me different. Yeah. I'm not even Asian enough for my grandmother.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? Like, so what am I? Oh, I'm neither. Right.
Yeah,
and I think that's why the discussion with people that have, these kind of thoughts as well is it helps because, you're kind of not welcomed in either way. So all us misfits hang out together, I guess. It's like, because we get it. We tell stories of our our thinking or how we grew up. And I think a lot of us understand because like, I never wanted my parents to put rice in my lunchbox because I didn't want other kids to like laugh at me or something, simple things like that.
That has been so twisted, I think, for me growing up, because 100% like did not want to be the smelly curry girl and got made so much fun of. And now people are trying to figure out turmeric. Tumor is something that you get when you have cancer. Turmeric, there's an R, you can pronounce it how it's spelled, is what Indians use in cooking, right? And now it's like trendy, and now people are like, oh my God, can you make this thing? And that has been so trippy for me. I'm not sure if you guys have had that experience of, I had to hide that when I was younger, and now all of a sudden it's cool. And
now it's cool.
Yeah, now
my Korean friend said that to me because like Korean K-pop and all that stuff is so cool now. And they were like, I had to hide even knowing Korean when I was a kid,
Yeah.
Well, that's why there's something about the first generation identity and building of it that I think there is just not enough literature on and not enough portrayal on.
I'm not sure how you meant that, Billy, but I would kind of tend to disagree a bit because with reference to what Liz was saying about the stories that aren't being told, Asian Americans have been here for generations and generations and generations. And even now, less so than before, because granted, there has been progress, but even now, there's this kind of tendency to, in my opinion, overly focus on first-generation stories, like the immigrant experience, which granted is a part of the Asian American experience, but it's one part. Again, we've been here for generations and generations, like a vast spectrum of different stories. How about the stories where people are incidentally Asian American? They just happen to be, like, one of the reasons why I like Glenn from The Walking Dead in the comics, in the show, he just happens to be Asian. He's a regular guy like everyone else. Versus, stories that, like I took Asian American literature courses in college, and I read those early waves of literature, Bharati Mukherjee's Jasmine, Ron Young Kim's Clay Walls, probably the most popular one, of course, Amy Tan's Joy Luck Club. I read those, I appreciated them, I thank God for them, but I was ready to move on. Other stories, please.
I think there might have been a confusion because, and this actually came up in some of our other panels, there seems to be two definitions for first generation. The first definition is the people who immigrate. And the second one is the children and the progeny of those who immigrate. When I used first generation, I meant the first generation born in America, and so on and so forth. If I had been talking about the people who did immigrate, I would agree with you 110%. I think what I was talking about, and I probably, when I use literature, I should have specified academic literature. After grad school, there is no literature. There's only academic literature, and no fun, no hope left in life after grad school. But that's a different panel. Like when you mentioned Glenn, I loved his portrayal because, like you said, he just happened to be Asian. It normalized that this is a man who is sexy, like Liz was saying earlier. He's sexy, he's strong, he portrays all the masculine narratives of traditional American norms, North American norms, I should say. All of those things, but he looks like me. Mm-hmm. Kelly from The Office and Tom from Parks and Rec.
Yeah. So I love that because obviously as a South Asian, there's all these other things that I'm supposed to be: quiet, docile, meek, sweet, subservient, of course, good at math, whatever other stupid things. And then to see someone who is bubbly and ditzy and boy crazy and fun and funny, that was phenomenal. On a separate note, the number of people that have told me that I look like Mindy Kaling, no, I absolutely do not. And so that is a huge issue too for me, right? That there's still that kind of lumping that happens. But I did get someone once who said, it was a friend's boyfriend, and this was like, one of those, you're supposed to like, oh, is he a good guy? Let me know. And then of course his first thing was like, oh my God, you know what? You know who you remind me of? You know who you remind me of? Mindy Kaling. And I was immediately like, no. I don't like him. And then he saved himself. He was like, yeah, it's just, I think it's the personality. You're so bubbly and outgoing. And I was like, oh my God. Yeah, okay, sure. I'll give you that one, right? But that was so nice to actually have it be, you're a bubbly, fun Indian. And there's another bubbly, fun Indian I know. I loved that.
I got a lot of, you look like Glenn. It's the baseball. I'm glad Billy said sexy, because I mean, if it was something different, then I'd be like, "You're out of here." No, it's
the hat.
But it's true though. Like going back to the discussion about this, like as an Asian man growing up, I still have a ton of hangups about how I look and who I am. So in a lot of ways, sometimes especially when I was younger, I would overcompensate it by being ultra aggressive. Like playing sports, I would be the person that played the hardest, the person that played you want to come hit me, I might be smaller, but I'll take your knees out, like that kind of thing, where they would not come close to me. So you overcompensate in other ways because you're trying to throw off the stereotype of what is expected of you. But then after a while, I'm closer to 40 now. I don't need to play those games anymore. At least but the initial, whenever something like that comes into play, it's still there. It's still sitting there scratching in the back, being like, and it's hard to shake these kind of things. But going to talking about stories, these are the kind of things that I would like to, whenever I create, I only ever co-wrote one thing in my life, so I don't really do that as much, but these are the kind of things that I really appreciate. No matter what race or whatever the character is, I like these kind of things being brought up as those kind of things where you worry about those stereotypes of what you're expected to be and how people deal with it or get over it or don't get over it.
When earlier we were speaking of Glenn from Walking Dead, on one side, I really do like the fact, and a friend of mine, Iffy, a great comedian, once said, when the well is dry, you thirsty, so you're going to just grab on to anyone that represents you. I really like the fact that in The Irregulars on Netflix, and also coming soon, Shadow and Bone, I believe, on Netflix as well. Both leads are Asian females. They're like half Asian, half white, but they look more like me, right? Or vice versa. Like they are Asian, and their ethnicity is second. They are the character that they play, and they're, you know, they're not, I don't know, like the typical, you know, Asian prostitute or whatever, or the dragon lady, right? You got one or the other. Neither character is that. They could have very easily went with someone who was completely dark hair with blue eyes, or blonde and blue eyes, or whatever they would have wanted. But they went with those two young ladies as leads. And I felt that that was really good. And it was something that, I'm an only child, so I don't have a younger sister, but, you know, had I would have been happy in seeing kind of the representation that there is. On the flip side, I don't like it when those that are not of Asian descent use that as being like, see, ethnicity should have nothing to do with casting.
Yeah.
No, remember, it's about the character first. Doesn't matter what race they are after that. And I was like, but that's not for you to decide.
And it's gone so far on one side though, right?
Yeah,
so of course you gotta like try to pull on the lever on the other side. But they don't see that. They don't see that.
It is. And I try to explain to them something like Shang-Chi or something like Iron Fist, or, you know, with like Snake Eyes. I remember being so shocked he was a white guy. I was like, oh, as a child, I was like, what happened? But it depends on who is wanting to create those movies.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so I said it comes down to who the creator is and who wants those films. Because I don't have a problem with Warrior. Mm-hmm. Now it's going to be on HBO Max and everything, but I would have the issue, for example, how, you know, the Bride of the Nine Spiders was portrayed in Iron Fist. She was on Netflix. She was very much a stereotypical everything, like the over-sexualized Asian woman who's like the dragon. It was all things were wrong, but it depended on who was driving the force behind it, and the Warrior storyline had a very different driving force to the creators who chose to portray that villainous like that in, let's say, Iron Fist.
If you are going to kind of do that classic stereotype because it is real and because we know those people, hey, I'm okay with that, right? I'm not going to tell you that doesn't exist. But if you do that in today's climate, then you better put on someone like Mindy Kaling, someone who's like totally different and kind of counterbalances that, right?
Yes.
Hey, there is this,
yes,
but also there is this, and you can't do this without this anymore. I think is the point.
Yes, and the good thing about Warriors, it wasn't just all martial arts and like brothels, which was an important time of the San Francisco culture during that time, but they also addressed racism and the fact that the brothel owner, the main female there, in a behind the scenes says, you have to understand at that time, it was very hard for a woman to be a business owner, have her own money, and an Asian woman as a business owner and have her own money. So it wasn't like they only took what was good, which was martial arts and hot women or whatever, but they also did the opposite of that, which was the extreme racism that they had to face, the fact that they couldn't own their own land. They were being screamed at by the cops at the time. So there was a lot of, I try to tell people who are not part of the AAPI community, you can't have one thing without the other. If you're going to want to appreciate all of the things, then you cannot ignore the other stuff. I'm very much into the Kaiju community, and it was very interesting seeing how many people love Godzilla and where it comes from.
Yeah.
And then they're like, no, it's isolated incident for Asian hate. Or like, so they only take what was good. They want the movie, the film, the toys, but then they don't, the irony of that, right, is that they don't see all the Asian issues that come with that. So, you know, I try to tell them, if you want to, almost like a challenge, if you want to take part of our culture, you're going to have to take the bad things with it.
I wonder if it's like pop culture in general, I feel like it's kind of like that. Unfortunately, I feel like
right.
You totally miss the point of the whole story. Like how many superhero things, like let's say Captain America, right? Like Captain America and what you know he represents is supposed to be the best of America, or of the character of the time and all this kind of stuff. And or even Superman. Like Superman's a great example, like hope and all this kind of stuff. And I don't mean to rag on Zack Snyder or nothing, but it's so interesting to see kind of the lens that Zack Snyder put Superman on, because I really felt like it was everything that was like, oh, Superman should do this, but like none of the what made him special and what made him that kind of immigrant story of, you know, secret identity to try to like protect yourself and your family from the knowing that you're different, but then also showing off how great you are deep down inside in a very positive way, and it's completely missed, and you're like, you totally missed it. Or like Star Wars, where people are like, they think that they're the rebels. I mean, there was a discussion these days. I'm like, I don't know if you think you're the rebels because you're more like the Empire than the rebels, right? Like,
It's amazing. Yeah, it's amazing how many white nationalists I know who love Captain America and Superman.
You just miss the point, right?
And it's like, oh my, just because they look white doesn't mean that's what's going on.
Yeah, didn't Superman, wasn't he created because that's like Joe Shuster, Siegel and Schuster were Jewish, were they not? And it was their kind of way of explaining their feelings of hiding who they were. And then obviously like they felt like, but I'm really good at stuff, so I have, you know, I want to show that I am good.
Travis spoke about that quite a bit on the Superman panel, kind of the origins of that. And like you said,
I actually wish we had some time to talk about the stuff that we do like, and Thinker is, you know, not necessarily free of problems, but is doing a pretty good job. Jessica mentioned Warrior. I'm obviously a fan of the show because, you know, I have the logo in the background, my digital background. One of the things where I think the reason that show is pretty good is it shows you know, a very important period of Asian American history. It's like, yes, people, we you know, Chinese Americans were here that far back, and yes, they had, you know, a very important role. And the other thing is no accents, thank God, you know, like no unnecessary accents anyway. Just kind of amazing in some ways is the sheer amount of sex in the show. And what I mean by that is because, yes, as people have mentioned, traditionally, Asian men and Asian women have been portrayed differently. Asian men have been asexual through much of pop culture, and Asian women have been hypersexualized, but not with agency, right? It's kind of like, it's one thing to be hypersexual but have agency. It's another thing to be like the object of desire for the white male gaze. In Warrior, you have all these people having sex with who they want, the way they want, Asian men, Asian women. It's just kind of like, I never saw that before in anywhere, in any film, TV, like so many Asian men and women just having sex however they want, with whomever they want. In other words, exercising agency. In general, they're exercising agency in the show, the characters, even in situations that are really difficult. And also, yes, sexually, we are sexual beings, we're human, you know?
Well, I mean, that is for sure a hang up I have. I mean, I've even heard it from my own family members that grew up in Canada, that and I heard from a cousin of mine who she once told me she doesn't date Asian men because the Asian men are either too Chinese or they're pretending not to be Chinese. And I'm like, you're talking straight to me. Like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, first of all, you need to meet more Asian men, or just like, I don't know, like, what do you say to that when it's your own family members telling you these things? And
another really great representation, as we're talking about accents, because I know that mine comes and goes depending on my emotional state. Different things come out. There's a really, really fantastic comic called Almost American Girl, and the Korean and the English are done in different fonts, different coloring, and it's beautiful. It's beautifully done, and it's a really great comic to visually look at and to read through. It's very touching. Definitely with the accents, I think we would be remiss to not talk about Kim's Convenience.
I love that show. Obsessionally love that show.
It's beautiful in so many ways, and it can definitely talk a lot about different experiences, and it really shows a lot of the Korean American experience.
It shows with compassion the experience of both the younger generation that's trying to fit in to Canada, as well as with so much love, tenderness, and compassion. The older generation that's like trying to hold on to the roots and maybe not interested in acculturating as much. And so that's my favorite part of that show is there's not a centralized character or experience. It kind of just gives you all of it at the same time, which is how real life actually works. And so I recommended that to 100% of my Korean clients, whether they really asked or not, just because I was like, have you seen Kim's Convenience? It is such a good show.
You know, this is making me think that we should all recommend one work of anything, literature, television, film, anything, with a sort of a quick explanation of why we're recommending it.
One of our audience questions, they wanted to know recommendations for who's making it work.
BHP Comics is an indie press in Scotland that actually comes out with a lot. There's also Graphic India that has a bunch of Indian mythological stories, and they're doing that phenomenally well, again, with love from within. They also had, Graphic India had Stan Lee do a character called Chakra for them, and so that also focuses on Indian mythology.
I really like, and I'm sure a couple people here follow him already, Joshua Luna's comics on Twitter. He focuses on Asian American struggles, both immigrant and additional generations. And he comes at it with such a passion and almost a fury that matches my fury. Because a lot of times I want to be an advocate and I want to give that space. But a lot of times I just want to burn shit down. Like a lot of times I'm just angry about it. And he has a great mix of that.
You know, I try to tell a small mixture for friends if it's going to be a show. Something that I laughed, but also was super painful at the same time was Fresh Off the Boat. It was, I felt that with the SAT after class, but at the same time, you have a mom that wants to drive you so hard, but she's a lot more, Jessica Huang, also because we share the same first name, is a lot more compassionate, but she's just like, she's a good portrayal in the mix. Fresh Off the Boat is one. I feel like for certain things I laugh at, my friends don't understand. So I was like, you know, definitely feel free to ask me. Like the dishwasher is never used. It's a drying rack. That is something. When it comes to just books, the language that it's translated for you will help, which is Journey into the West. We love Sun Wukong, the Monkey King. And there, obviously we have many, many other great characters, but there's a reason why he's so well loved, because he's so cunning, so smart. He's still very hilarious. He's not perfect. With that, I know in May for AAPI month, both Marvel and DC are having like a little anthology or a collect all. I'm like, Marcus, correct me if I'm wrong. If that they're coming out with all of their Asian American characters. And I think for DC, it will be led by Cassandra Cain. And then over at Marvel, they've got like Kamala, Shang-Chi, they have Silk, they have all the other ones. I do know that a version of Sun Wukong is not the Monkey King, it's going to be the Monkey Prince. Will be coming out with over at DC. I'm interested to see how that goes, because you have the people, and they're often not Asians saying it, but sometimes there are, who said, isn't it a little bit racist? That's always the same character they keep going for. At the same time, others are like, but we're so excited. Our most popular character is now, we're going to see it in DC. So I really think in the end, it depends on how that character is done. And when it comes to a podcast, I do recommend Nigel Ning and Evelyn's Rice to Meet You. He also does, he's a comedian. It's because she is Asian, but she's from Sweden, living in London, and he is Malaysian comedian living in London. And they are there, kind of both comedians. They do a podcast. They also have their own YouTube show. And he did Uncle Roger with like how non-Asians cook fried rice or whatever. It was a great video that blew him up. But both of them come together and they talk about their Asian experience in countries like Sweden, Norway, the UK, Scotland, Ireland, what it's like to be there, and also try to also, in a way, I understand how they feel, even though I am not living or raised there. I'm here in the States. but I understand, and they do it with such love and compassion, but there's comedy to it at the same time, very real issues, because Nigel was recently attacked in the streets of London. So it was, I think it's a very good balance of the harsh reality, but also they're not making light of it, but they are naturally comedians as well. Oh, Ali Wong.
I want to go a little bit further back for my recommendation. This is actually a play. It's one of my favorite works of literature. I haven't actually seen the actual play. I've only read the play. There's a movie version, but it's bad, or it's not so good. And that is David Henry Hwang's M. Butterfly, which is a scathing indictment of the way that historically and traditionally the white male patriarchy has kind of like had this sort of colonial gaze towards Asian people. And this is not really a spoiler because it's part of the plot blurb if you look up anywhere, but it basically involves a French diplomat who falls in love with a Chinese opera singer who's a Chinese spy who's actually a man, but he poses as a woman. And he fools the French diplomat for 20 years, basically, that he's a woman. And this is based on a real historical story or actual historical event. And Huang's play, I mean, it's genius. It's so dense with all like critiques of everything we've been talking about. And so that is a work I would really recommend for something that kind of does it right. And I appreciate all the other great recommendations. One quick thing I would like to add, I'm taking a chance on this one because it's not even out. So I don't know if it's going to be really as good as I'm hoping it's going to be, but Image Comics in general does a great job, I feel like, with really interesting Asian American characters that are kind of incidentally Asian, the way I was talking about earlier. There's Tony Chu from the comic title Chu. Mm-hmm. But there's one coming out in a few months called The Good Asian. And from what I've seen about it so far, it looks really good. And I recommend that people support it, maybe get, copies when they come out. And because we gotta support this kind of stuff if we want more of it. The kind of stuff that we want, that the saying goes, you vote with your dollars, right? But it's true.
I was gonna say Superman versus the Klan.
I'm reading that now.
Jin Luen Yang. That one, yeah. And there's also other ones that like George George did, and there are some really good ones. And Jin Luen Yang does a lot for first, second books. He does a lot of good, also Asian American experiences.
All right, if we're doing this, then Untold is fabulous also for South Asians.
I don't have a book. I just have a bunch of magic cards, so I can't really hold anything up.
My Superman, I was going to carry Superman Smashes the Klan in here with me and left it down the hall.
Monstrous, Marjorie Liu. And, my God, yeah, very good. Yes. Oh, so I don't know where she is, but Elizabeth. Yeah, that one's good.
Oh, American Born Chinese. Yes. Also fantastic. Utilizes the story of the Monkey King as well. Not all comics are fiction. Some incorporate that, and that's also something that sometimes is so beautiful, is to witness someone else's story and to share their stories with others and to have that be relatable. And so the connection between those who are creators and those who are consumers is also incredibly beautiful. But when we talk about incidental characters that didn't necessarily have to be Asian, I mean, we can talk about like Jimmy Woo, right? Like pretty much most characters, right? We can talk about Russell in Up. He didn't have to be Asian. We can talk about a lot of Star Trek characters that didn't necessarily have to be the racial background that they were, but the fact that they were was also just beautifully upheld in many, many ways. We can also talk about some of the animated people who are Asian but are voiced by non-Asians.
Yeah.
even being a therapist, I love that there was this beautiful family therapy episode in Rick and Morty.
Yeah.
But also that part of me that's like, I mean, I love it. I would have loved it more had you had an Asian actress. Though I love Susan Sarandon. I think she did wonderful. She had a very soothing voice, but it was a missed opportunity.
Mm-hmm. The thing that I want to say about that is I don't think we live in a time where we can afford, in any sense of the word afford, any more missed opportunities. So this was cute when we were stumbling and bumbling and figuring it out in the early whenever. I would hope that decades and centuries, frankly, later, we would be beyond that. Those missed opportunities that I think we all try to be so sort of, I'm just going to say politely Asian about, right? Like that level of, oh, and so, they could, I think I'm with everything that's been going on lately, I think pretty outraged, and I think more comfortable saying missed opportunity, is such a nice way to put that. And I really appreciate you for saying it that way, but no, it's, can we say the F word?
Billy already did.
Billy did.
Well, it's a fuck up. It's not a fuck. It's just, It's like just a fuck up, right? Because when you do something where it was so simple and so easy, and you took the effort to actually make that character Asian, then why wouldn't you go that one extra step? There are so many Asian voice actors, Asian talent that could have pulled that off for that, 5 lines? That wouldn't have even been difficult.
Silk has been teased as possibly appearing in the Spider-Verse sequel. All I'm saying is, they better not fuck up, as Dr. said.
There are not very many Asian therapists either. There are not enough people of color in the mental health field. And how damaging is that? And when we talk about the colonialization of healing and a variety of other things that I kind of a little touched upon, but that's also a very huge issue. Mm-hmm. And that to represent someone but not have them be present is so a thing.
Yes, they made a big deal twice on Jubilee in the live action X-Men. Yeah, you saw her. I can't quite remember if she spoke. She may have, but we know in editing they speak, and then an editor will be like, well, we didn't have time for that, so we had to cut her part down, or whatever. But the joy of just seeing her in the background, it's already, at least for me in my experience, I've never heard I've only heard people say Jubilee, right? So I've never really heard people say the Asian mutant or the Asian or the, so that's already great. But at the same time, we also want to hear her speak and see a little bit more of that. People bring up Lady Deathstrike to me all the time. I love Kelly Hu, but her character didn't really speak that much in X2. But we have, to focus on the X-Men, we have Jubilee, who's such a different Asian kid, right? Growing up in the West world, she was just different. She's a character I obviously grew to appreciate and love more as I got older and everything. But they made it a deal to say that she's there in the live action film. She's on the IMDb. She's there. There are sometimes actresses that you actually recognize, and then she didn't really speak. They're just in the background. They're just there. So it would be nice if she spoke more.
And then talking about how damaging that is, that voicelessness to a community that already struggles with speaking up, taking up space, having a voice. I was deeply fortunate enough in my graduate training to be part of an Asian professional development group that started that year. Yeah, Billy. Billy and I were fortunate enough. And what was so beautiful about that is we would have these warm, intimate conversations about what is it like being Asian in this field? What is it like being Asian in the world? And what do you struggle with? Speak up for yourselves, use your voice. No one will tell you to do that. But if you do not do that, people will be happy to have you be the silent token member in a corner. And so I think when that is already the message that in our group, all of us, every single person kind of nodded a little bit, right? Then how is that not reflected in the media? How do we not make so sure not to make that mistake then in the media? I'll use nicer language.
Can I ask a question? And this is more so for personal reasons, considering portrayal of Asians in the media and representation. I was really thrown off during, and I'll try not to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it, two sentences in the most recent episode of Falcon and Winter Soldier. And my wife actually even noticed me visibly not engaged in watching the story anymore because it bugged me so much, especially in our current climate.
Mm-hmm.
And it was Mr. Din, the Vietnamese man who was going to buy the boat. And the two sentences that like just threw me out were when the kids were talking to Sam and they were talking about the conversation. And then one of the kids gives a throwaway line. Yeah. And then he said something in Vietnamese and they kind of giggled a little bit, which was unnecessary. And then the second part was them saying, mild spoiler for a subplot. He backed out from buying the boat. But the way she said it was Mr. Din backed out. But then when you see the community, again, mild spoiler for a subplot, when you see the entire community get together to help them fix the boat up, you see Black community members, you see white community members. He throws out a Latino/Hispanic name as someone who helped, but there was no positive Asian representation in that community. And it really bugged me because I'm thinking, we're seen as the foreigners, we're seen as the outsiders. Mm-hmm. So I checked on social media to see if it bugged anyone else. I posted about it. And, there didn't seem to be the same feeling that I got. So I don't know if I was reading too much into it or if I'm, and I know the therapists here.
That is so
therapists
valid.
are going to go, your feelings are valid no matter what, Billy.
Well, let me say why it's valid, because the thing that you're noticing is everything is about context, right? So in the context we're living in right now, like not just in a nice, sweet, your feelings are valid, your feelings are your feelings, right? But like your feelings are valid because like you said, this is not the time for that, right? And so I think that's an excellent point.
Thank you. It's that type of shit that it's like one data point, a correlation does not make. But this is one of so many data points that leads to people starting to internalize, whether they know it or not, that foreigners are outsiders, or I'm sorry, that Asians are outsiders, they're foreigners, they need to go home, they don't support the community, they just bring over a virus. And
I think another way it also shows it perpetrates in the subconsciously, Asians are cheap, mm-hmm. and they're going to be cunning when they're doing business. That's not true. It's not true.
I was a little nervous coming into this, to be perfectly honest, because I think some people are fed up and burnt out, and it's traumatizing for them to hear our pain. And that is the message I've received semi-consistently in the world. And so, yeah, I'm actually very grateful that was the response. That meant a lot to me.
I will concur in that. I have also heard people from various backgrounds say that there is no Asian hate going on, that this is not an issue, and a variety of different kinds of things that go along with the gaslighting and the silencing that really hurts, mm-hmm. and perpetuates the pain. And a part of that too is that there is this internalized grieving process that is happening for a lot of people who used to make lots of Asian jokes, who used to do lots of things, and to be told, oh, that's racist, and that's hard to confront. And there's that grieving process that involves the stages of grief. It used to be 5, they've added more, but that denial, well, that can't be happening, that can't truly be happening. And I've even had that experience as well. I have an older brother, and prior to the shooting in Atlanta, for positionality, I'm from Atlanta. My brother still lives there. And when I say I'm from, because I've lived in so many places, I lived in Atlanta prior to Chicago. And weeks prior to the shooting in Atlanta, he sent our mother and me pepper spray, because that's what older brothers want to do. They want to protect the people that they care about. And the shooting in Atlanta happened, and he doubled down into this Kanye West-like rant about how there is not Asian hate crimes happening. This happened because workers. This won't happen to you. And he was so incredibly adamant about this because he needed to distance himself. And he needed to say, this will not happen to my family, not my loved ones. This isn't really true. And there are going to be a lot of people who are having a variety of experiences. And it's so, so hard to acknowledge the powerlessness that also is happening for a lot of people, to recognize that our seniors are women. And I mean, you can even go back into within our lifetime, I'm guessing here, not to be offensive, but that things like this have occurred before within our lifetime. If we look at Stockton, which happened in the 80s, when we look at Vincent Chin, which happened in the 80s, that these are experiences where the crimes occurred. Stockton, for people who are not aware, it was a school. It was a school with Southeast Asian refugees that were targeted. Children were murdered, 20 people shot, maybe 23. 5 children were killed. What happened after that? Was it acknowledged as a hate crime? When Vincent Chin, who was on his bachelor party, was murdered by a couple of guys with baseball bats, beaten to death, and at their sentencing, the judge said, these aren't the kinds of guys we send to jail. And so those murderers who did it in front of people, plenty of witnesses, no question about who did this, what happened. And it happened because they thought he was Japanese, and Japanese car makers, the auto industry was taking away their jobs. By the way, they weren't mad at the German auto industry. They were mad at the Japanese. And they murdered him, and they never had like jail time. It was like 3 years of probation. And this murder happens, this mass murder, which a lot of people say, oh, the event in Atlanta. No, this mass murder that happened where someone went to 3 different businesses, right? 1, 2, 3. How many times, and you're targeting specifically Asian women. Now, some people were killed because they just happened to be there. And, we talk about this, 8 people died, majority of whom were Asian women. We don't talk about like, oh, how many people were shot and missed, etc. But what we also want to talk about and bring to light is that if you look at the Korean media, which I know not everybody has access to because of language barriers, etc., but it is reported very differently than it is the US media. And in a lot of US media, the Asian hate crimes that have been occurring for this entirety of the pandemic were not reported either.
Yeah.
When you look at history classes, these things are not reported. I believe somebody said earlier they didn't even know about the Japanese internment camps until later in their lives. And that goes along with the erasure. That goes along with we just won't tell you about it. We just won't talk about it. We just won't acknowledge that this is happening. And that is extremely damaging. If you've ever worked with anyone who has experienced a variety of traumas, one of the worst things you can do is to tell them that their trauma is not real, that it doesn't really happen. For a lot of research, it shows that it's not just the event of the trauma, but it's the response as well.
Yeah.
And how many times are people being told that what happened to them oh, it didn't really happen, or oh, that person didn't really mean it.
Yeah.
And, you know, earlier when we were talking about appropriation and appreciation, and it was, oh, well, we can tell the intent. Sometimes that's used as the defense. Oh, well, my intention was, yeah, your intention was that, but what happened? What was the impact of that? Can you sit with that for a little bit, or is that too difficult to sit with? And for some people, that's extremely difficult. And then there's that denial, and then there's that perpetuating of the harm.
Yeah.
And let's focus on how you're making me feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And then there's that defensiveness that comes with it. Well, and I've gotten this when I've brought it up, including people who will speak in an accent to other people, whether or not it's, oh, I'm sorry, I just do that because I tend to copy the accent. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't care, don't do it. You know, it's a cultural trauma. It's a trauma for an individual. It's a trauma for that specific subculture, and it's a trauma for an entire culture.
Yeah. And I think it also goes with people who try to use as people, we're not monoliths. We're not a monolithic culture. So it is very easy to have someone say, but so-and-so told me it was not a very big deal and they're Asian. And I try to tell them the difference is, one, I don't know what their mindset is, maybe due to wanting to assimilate. They see themselves as white. I don't know. But you also have to understand it depends, to take into account the generation that person is from, because sometimes they go through such hardship in their motherland, and they come here because America is portrayed and is known for the American dream. It's beautiful. In Mandarin Chinese, it's called Meiguo, which actually means beautiful country. So they see this place to give our kids a better life and everything. So when something really terrible like this happens, sometimes they felt that because they lived through worse, this is nothing, or they don't want to necessarily admit that there are issues here in the US, or just, you know what, I know it happens, but we're going to keep our, because they're very tough. The older generation is extremely resilient. And because of that, they have to take into account that just because they say that doesn't mean they're not in the back of their mind mentally, aware. Also, because if you're Taiwanese, my mom's from Taiwan, my dad was from Hong Kong, just crime is very little over there. But when it is there, it's just seen on it's just crime, right? But then here, there's a racial component to it. So they don't always, keep that into mind. So when I tell them, when you try to use them as an example, they are the exception. You need to see, first of all, poll many people, speak to many people, and then see kind of how we feel more collectively as a majority, instead of trying to pick out that one person who just may be like, no, it's fine. It happens. It was a one-time thing. It's okay. We're just gonna keep going, because their experiences are so different,
It's absolutely heartbreaking to me for people to give up everything, leave their families, and come to the land of milk and honey, only to find that the milk has spoiled and the honey is dried.
Yeah. They don't want to see that. And you also have to take into account when they say something like, there's so much, I wouldn't say so much worse racism and crime now. I try to tell them that you also have to understand they came at a place where there was not as much disruption or trying to make the, Canada and US better. But it was always there. We just didn't have social media. So now that they are seeing it, maybe perhaps to them, it's suddenly coming out as a huge wave, but it's actually always been there. So you really have to I try to tell them, you have to take into account the person that you're getting that opinion or that fact, or however they feel from, So I feel like it's a very different. I do feel, we all take it very seriously, but there's always that little subsection, and then they're used as a weapon against us.
One of the difficulties that happens, unfortunately, especially as the algorithms have gotten so great, at polling, like, oh, this person's interested in this. But it's that confirmation bias, which is part of the antithesis of what science is, right? We want to test the null hypothesis. We want to see, what evidence do I have to contradict this hypothesis? And instead, people are saying, well, let me look for all the evidence that says it's right. Let me confirm this bias that I have, or this idea that I have. And part of that too happens when people subscribe to limited media, or they have a limited group of friends, or the representation and the people involved in the creation and the curation are limited. And that is also a difficulty.
Yes, and I try to tell people that when they said Ghost in the Shell was fine, and friends in Japan were very happy about it. And I said, but you have to, first of all, different news media, because here we are a salad or melting pot, depending on how everyone wants to see it. Here in Canada, UK, and America and Australia, but in Japan it's homogenous, right? So they're just excited that Ghost in the Shell is being made. Also, where they get their American news is very different. So I always try to read different, like you said, where you get your news from, where you get different things, and also to understand that, but this movie is marketed to the US and Canada and all these Westerns, not they will watch it in Japan, but it's marketed to us. So you need to understand why we feel this certain way because of this, and this reason. But I think it is important, right? Like you said, to see different news media and also understand that, because that was one of the number one reasonings that was given, which is like, well, Japanese friends were really happy. And I was like, I am happy for them, because they're seeing something that they love adapted into Hollywood. But you also have to understand why we feel this way. That is happening.
Yeah, and that reaction is so symptomatic of actually the ongoing continual inability for a disturbingly wide portion of American society to be able to tell the difference between Japanese and Japanese American, or Korean and Korean American. Like, oh yeah, my Korean friends are fine. I'm like, are they from Korea? I was like, yeah. It's a totally different power dynamic. It's and the fact that, like, I would never say, I don't know, what's a similar, like, oh, my friends from Ireland were fine with it. It just would never occur to me to say something like that, right? To anyone. And so the inability to tell the difference, which is mind-boggling to us, and yet it persists. It's amazing how big a problem it actually is still.
Yeah.
Well, because in a lot of people's minds, anyone from Europe, you're still Caucasian, you're still white, and you're still American. And I think that's one of the key differences, right? Is when people see us, for most of the time, and Marcus, much love to my Canadian brother over there, who, I don't know, hopefully is your mic. Can you say something to see if your mic started working?
Is it okay? No.
Still sound like Megatron. Go into it, bro. Lean into it. Be like, yeah, I'm a robot. Yeah, I'm a mecha, baby. The Marvel mecha. Anyway, so what I was saying.
Interrupted your own train of thought.
I do that often. When people see Asian Americans, and this extends to other cultures, when people see Hispanic Americans, when people see Black Americans, even though the history of Black America is rooted in the slavery and them being taken from their own country, not by their own will, people often don't see American. They see American as a very specific stereotype, and everything else is blank descriptor hyphen American, if that last American part is there at all. Which is why there's such a conflation between, oh, well, my Asian friend said it was okay. Yes, but they're from Asia. And just like Daniel said, different power dynamics, different cultures. We are, for those of us who live here, whose blood bleeds Asian, but our hearts beat American. It's a very different very unique experience.
That was almost like a mic drop.
Yeah,
For
it sounds like one.
Please like and subscribe for more content.
Oh, okay. All right, everybody, safe travels, sleep well.
Thank you. Thank
I'm
you.
gonna go
Thank
play with a
you.
3-year-old now.
Thank
And
you.
thank you for joining us.
Thank
It's nice
you.
to meet you, Marcus.
Nice to meet you as well. Nice to meet everyone.
Thank you,
I'll get this
Marcus.
figured out better. I'll get this figured out better next time.
Yeah, and
Thank you,
Elizabeth
Travis.
finally sounded really clear there in the latter part. Who knows what was going on there?
Maybe my emotional state.
Maybe that was it.